enjoying coffee after a fine meal at a European cafe, until the bill comes. What is VAT tax? Yes, value-added tax, a tax on top of the regular tax. 2 taxes. Perhaps we could write a program to help you be better prepared for meals at restaurants with VAT taxes. Okay, so let's look at the particular situation in which we find our tourist. The country he is in charges a regular sales tax on top of his meal, which is 10%. In addition, there is a second tax, the VAT tax, which is also 10%. If we were to write a program to help solve this problem, our first step would be to determine what are the fixed values and what values would change from run to run. Well, the 2 fixed values we have are the regular tax rate, which is 10%, and the VAT tax rate, which is also 10%. So we should save those values in variables inside the program. And once again, we want to save them into variables that have meaningful variable names so that they're easy to find, understand, and change later if we need to. The second thing we want to think about is what value is likely to change from run to run. In this case, the price of the meal will certainly change, and therefore we want it to be input each time the program is executed. So let's consider our calculation. The final cost of our meal would be the initial cost plus the VAT tax amount plus the sales tax amount. And we would want to output that for the user. So let's look at translating that into code. So first, let's create 2 variables to save our tax rates in. We'll call the first one VAT tax rate and set it equal to 0.10 for our 10% tax rate. And then we'll create a second variable called sales tax rate, which is also set equal to 0.10. Now we're ready to get the information for the cost of the meal. So let's create a variable called meal cost, and we will set it equal to the value that our user is going to input. We'll simply have an input statement, input parenthesis, in which we then have the string enter meal cost in quotes to prompt the user to enter the cost of the meal. Now remember, the straight input statement will pick up the cost of the meal as a string. So in order to make sure that that input value is treated as a real number, we're going to cast it to a float. And we do that again by putting the word float and enclosing the whole input statement in parentheses, because that's going to be a string and we want it to be treated as a real number. Now that we have all the values we need for the calculation, let's go ahead and do some math. To make our code clearer, we're going to actually calculate the amount of the VAT tax and the sales tax and save them into individual variables. So let's create a variable called Vat Tax Amount and set it equal to the meal cost that the user had input times our VAT tax rate. Now we'll create a second variable called Sales Tax Amount and set that equal to our meal cost times the sales tax rate. Now we'll create a new variable to save our final meal cost. We'll set that equal to the meal cost, which was the original value that the user input, plus the VAT tax amount, plus the sales tax amount. And finally, we'll print it out by saying print, and then we'll have a bit of a label, in quotes, total cost after taxes, and then a comma, and we'll output the value in final meal cost. Okay, so let's trace this code. The first thing that happens is Python will create a brand new variable, VAT tax rate, because that's the first time it's seen that variable. And it assigns the value 0.10 into it. Next, it will create a variable called sales tax rate, and again, set the value 0.10 into it. Now, we will prompt the user for the input. The next thing that happens is that Python will create a new variable called meal cost, because it's the first time it's seen it. And what's it going to assign to it? Well, it's going to use the input statement to display on the screen, enter meal cost. Let's assume that our user then enters 20. That will be read in by the input statement and converted to a real number by float. So that real value of 20 will be assigned to meal cost. Now we're ready to do the calculations. So first we're calculating the VAT tax amount. And again, that's going to be meal cost. So we look at the value in the variable meal cost and multiply it by the value in the variable VAT tax rate, which is 0.10. So the result of that calculation, 2, will be placed into the variable VAT tax amount. Next, a new variable called sales tax amount will be created. That will be assigned the meal cost, again, the value in that variable is $20, times the value in the variable sales tax rate. That gives us 2, and the value 2 will be assigned to sales tax amount. Next, Python will create a brand new variable called final meal cost. What's it going to assign to it? Well, the result of adding meal cost, which is 20, and the VAT tax amount, which is 2, and the sales tax amount, which is another 2. So in total, that's 24, and that value will be assigned to final meal cost. All that's left to do is display it for the user. So the print statement will first output the string total cost after taxes, and then it will output the value in the variable final meal cost, which, as we can see, is 24. Let's talk a little bit about the programming style that we used here. First, notice that we placed the values 10% for both the VAT tax rate and the sales tax rate into variables with appropriate names. Secondly, we actually calculated the value for the VAT tax amount and the sales tax amount separately and saved them in variables. That wasn't really a necessary step, but in terms of the readability of the code, it makes it much clearer. That way, for instance, if our client who wanted us to write this program later said, you know what, I want you to output all the information, it's very easy to change the program and do that because we've already saved those values. Finally, you can see where calculating the final meal cost becomes very straightforward and what we call self-documenting. You can actually read the values where it says meal cost plus the VAT tax amount plus the sales tax amount. So it's very clear to see what happened. Okay, now it's your turn. How could we update this program to make it even better? Well, for one thing, as it is now, it will only work correctly in a country that has a regular tax rate of 10% and a VAT tax rate of 10%. So that's not very flexible. How could we change the existing code that we have to allow it to work in a country regardless of its VAT tax rate and regardless of its regular tax rate? So think about it and actually work out the changes you can make. And you'll see that the way we structure the code makes it pretty easy to change. Second, I want you to think about how you would actually change the code if the client said, I don't just want to see the final total. I want to see a complete breakdown of what the actual original meal cost was, the amount of the VAT tax, the amount of the sales tax, and the total. What you're also going to see is that the way the code is structured allows you to pretty easily make those changes as well. Because remember, in the real world, we want to write code that's easy to understand, easy to adapt, and easy to expand, so that we're prepared to handle any additional requests or changes that might come up in the lifetime of the program.